Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, shall we get started? Yeah? All right, so welcome to week 4. Before I get started, as you can see, there's an invitation for you guys to participate in a lab experiment. Okay, so this experiment is run by one of our master students who are currently doing research in our school. Okay, so this experiment is about employee selection. Okay, it's related to accounting issues and also management issues. Okay, now I personally tried this experiment myself. It's quite fun. Okay, so if you're interested in, you can contact Ms. Wang Chuqi, okay, for the participation, or you can scan the QR code. So this ad is already on your Watto page. If you're interested in, you'll find the details there. Okay, so the duration of the game will be around 40 minutes, but you'll get paid. Okay, so you'll be paid for $20 gift card. Okay, so if you're interested, please go and check it. Okay, so we are now in week 4, right? And your assignment part A is due in week 6. Okay, if you haven't found a teammate for your group assignment, you need to let your tutor know as soon as possible. Okay, otherwise you'll put pressure on yourself in week 6 for completing part A of the assignment. Okay, now what we are going to do today is on the positive accounting theory. Okay, so we're going to talk about agency theory and the theory of a modern firm. Okay, next week we're going to talk about earnings management. So the topics that we are going to talk about next week is very relevant for your assignment. Okay, so because of that, I've already posted the lecture notes for week 5 to Watto. Okay, so if you want to start early, you can actually start from reading lecture notes for next week. Okay, of course I'm going to go through the details of next week's topic, but what I'm saying is if you want to start early, you don't want to put too much pressure on yourself in week 6, then you can start preparation for your assignment part A. Okay? Right, so I'll leave these for the moment. Okay, so let's quickly do a recap of what we did in the past in the last week, right? So last week we talked about normative theory. So I think everyone here probably have a good understanding now what do we mean by normative theory, right? So we said we'll talk about conceptual framework last week. We talk about the purpose for accounting standards. We talk about SAC 1 to SAC 4 and what's the evolution, right, of this of the conceptual framework. At the end of the lecture, we said measurement is always a critical aspect of accounting, right? So SAC 1 to SAC 4 address the purpose of accounting, who are the users, and what are the information that we care about, and what's the quality of the information. But there's one issue that has left, right, to be addressed, which is the measurement issue, okay? So we understand why we measure, and we understand what we measure, but we actually haven't reached a consensus in terms of what is the best way for us to measure, right? So that's what we did last week. So we talk about historical cost accounting to be the dominant measure in Australia and in a lot of other countries, okay? But we are going to come back to other measurement methods in week 11 and week 12, okay? So that's a very brief revision of last week. So what we are going to do today is to talk about positive theory. We're going to talk about the origins of positive accounting theory, okay? We're going to talk about agency cost and those agency relationship and what is accounting's role in this agency relationship, okay? So the last week we're going to talk about how do we control agency risk, agency cost in organizations. Okay, so we're going to talk about why do we need corporate governance. Okay, so you've heard of corporate governance in your other, when you study other courses. Okay, so we're going to talk about why do we need corporate governance and whether corporate governance can help us to reduce the agency cost. Okay, so today's topic is relevant for your assignment. Okay, so it tells you what is the motive or incentive behind earnings management. Okay, and next week we're going to talk about very specific management incentive in terms of earnings management. Okay, so consider today's topic is the foundation of positive accounting theory and those issues in the corporations. Okay, so what is positive theory? We touched this a little bit at the end of week 2, if you still remember. Okay, so we said positive accounting theory is there to explain and to predict accounting practice. Yes? So we start from 1 or 2 or a number of observations, and then we try to come to a conclusion, or we come to this theory about the whole population, right? So it's from very specific observations to a very general statement. We are using the inductive logic, right? So we talk about the Enron example in week 1. So Enron has a lot of problems in their, has a lot of accounting failures. So we talk about one of them is to treat their SPEs as using cost method instead of consolidation method, right? So, and then we come to this conclusion, right? So, because of Enron has this problem, and every time when a company set up a SPE, they are going to use cost method, and because they have these bad motivations behind that. Okay, so this then becomes a very general statement. So we start from one particular observations in practice, and we try to make a general statement. So can we test our statement? We can, right? So we can collect a number of firms' data for a period of time, and then we do some statistical analysis so we can know whether other firms are doing the same thing. If other firms are doing the same thing, then we can say our original hypothesis or our theory is supported by our test results. Okay? So as you can see, the positive accounting theory is heavily empirical based. Okay? So in fact, start from this week, when we are talking about accounting research, our focus is on the empirical research, okay? Which means we start from a few observations in practice, and then we try to come up with a general conclusion, and then we're going to use data to test it, okay? And then we use the results from the test to argue whether it supports our theory or not, okay? So that's positive accounting theory, heavily empirical based. Okay, and you all know what is normative theories now. Okay, so what is the focus of positive accounting theory? Okay, so the focus is on the relationships between various individuals, okay, and how accounting affects these relationships. So when we talk about these relationships between individuals in an organizational setting, we are not actually talking about you and me, 2 persons. Okay, so when we talk about these various individuals, we are talking about this various group of users or the group of stakeholders. Okay, so what are the examples of these relationships? We are talking about owners and managers. So owners are shareholders, right? So we talk about owners and the managers. We are talking about the managers or the firm and the debt providers. Okay, so the creditors. And we're talking about the managers and the regulatory bodies. Okay, so these are the key relationships that our course will cover. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the first 2, owners and the managers and debt providers. Okay, and then I think in week 8 or week 9, we're going to come back to manage the relationship between managers and regulatory bodies. Okay, I'm not quite sure which week, but yeah, we definitely will come back to the last point over here, okay? So we need to understand what are these relationships, right? What are the problems And then we're going to examine what is the role of accounting in these relationships, okay? So once again, before we move to the theory, right, positive accounting theory, we have to understand what is our basis. So what are the assumptions that underlie this positive accounting theory, okay? So remember, we talk about primitive terms, right? Before we can talk about theory, we need to achieve a common consensus, right? So we need to agree on some assumptions first. So the key assumption under the positive accounting theory basically saying everyone is selfish, okay? So individual's action is driven by self-interest. You have your own interest, I have my interest, okay? And sometimes you or me, okay, so we may actually act in an opportunistic manner in the extent that the actions will increase our own wealth. Does that make sense? Yes? So individuals is driven by their self-interest, and they may act opportunistically to pursue their own wealth. Okay, so that's the assumption underlying positive accounting theory. So in other words, when we look at positive accounting theory, we focus on the incentives, the self-motivation or the self-interest of different parties to a relationship. Okay? Now, what does this assumption mean is that we need to be aware of that people have different motivation. They are self-driven, self-interest driven, okay? And they may behave selfishly, but it doesn't mean that individual will always act in an opportunistic manner, okay? So when we come to the decision making, okay, so when you are making your own decision, you just need to be aware that the other party may have their own self-interest. It doesn't mean the other party will always act in a selfish way. Does that make sense? Yeah? Because a lot of times, okay, your self-interest and my self-interest might be aligned. Okay, so we have the same interest, therefore we can work together towards a common goal. Okay? But in some other times, your interest may be in conflict of my interest, therefore our behavior will be different. Okay? But it doesn't mean every time our interests are always in conflict. Okay? So this is the assumption that we have to make in positive accounting theory. Okay? So what are the fields of research? Okay? Under this big umbrella, well, there are a few fields. Okay, so if you are interested in doing accounting research, then basically we use positive accounting theory a lot. Okay, empirical accounting research. So the first big stream looks at the responses of users to financial information. Okay, now of course when we talk about users, right, we talk about investors we talk about investors or the shareholders. Yes, so you can actually survey individual users, what is their response to a certain financial information. Okay, so you can interview them, you can survey individuals. Okay, but sometimes it may not be that effective because your sample will be limited, right? So when we talk about users' response to certain financial information, we are actually looking at users as an aggregation, and this aggregation is the capital market. Okay, because if you are users, you are investors, right? Your common behavior on the market will be trading shares, right? So once there's a piece of information released to the market, right, the market as a whole will react to this information. Okay, so when we examine the responses to financial information or even non-financial information, we look at the capital market reaction as a whole. Does that make sense? So this is called capital market research, which is going to be discussed, I think, in week 6. Okay? So the capital market does not only react to financial information, they also react to non-financial information. Okay, so these days when we look at capital market research, it has 2 streams, right? So reaction to the financial information, for example, the announcement of the company's earnings, right, in last quarter. So this type of financial information, or some non-financial information, for example, a sudden death of CEO. How does the market react to a sudden death of CEO that you have shares in? Okay, or how does the market react to and unexpected changes to the board of directors of this company, okay? So this information are considered as non-financial information because they don't impact on the company's financial statement directly, but it will impact on the company's strategy, right? Which will have consequence to those financial numbers. So the capital market research examine users' response to those different kind of information, okay? So that's the first field. Okay. Now, other fields of positive accounting research looks at the factors affecting decisions made by firm, okay, or those within the firm. So we're going to talk about earnings management and accounting policy choice next week, okay, and then we're going to talk about voluntary disclosure and regulations in later weeks, okay. And then the role of accounting in motivating employees and the managers to act in the interest of shareholders. So the last bit, okay, will be discussed today, okay? So these fields, as you can see, because they are under the same umbrella, right? So the research are not isolated, okay? So in fact, there are interdependencies between these fields of research. So a lot of time, when you look at capital market research, it might combine with the factors, for example, that looks into earnings management, okay? So that's the fields of research, just to give a bit of flavor, you know, when you're reading the papers, okay, so what it feels to. So now let's talk about what is positive accounting theory, okay, so what is the origins? So the origins is the agency theory and the theory of firm, okay? Now, during the discussion later on, you can see these theories are not invented by accountants, okay? So these theories are actually invented or developed by economists, okay? So in fact, when we look at accounting theories, right, so our course, a big part is about accounting theories, but a lot of time when you keep digging, accounting theories are actually developed from economics theory, okay? They are developed from management theory or developed from psychology theory, okay? So we put them together as accounting theory because they have implications to accounting practice, okay? So let's talk about the theory of the firm first, okay? So in old days, okay, in neoclassical economics, those researchers, they consider firm as a black box, okay? So in the old days, they don't care about what's inside the box, but they only care about what's the input and what's the output, okay? So they can calculate how fast that we can transform the inputs to outputs. So that's all they care. Making sense? So if you look at this description from the basic behavior of the market, this definition is quite useful, right? So, or this description is quite useful because as an investor, for example, probably you only care how much you put in and how much you get out from the firm, right? But when you try to explain certain things happen within the firm, then this description cannot satisfy you, right? So this description does not tell us, for example, why are some firms bigger than others, right? So in the old days, even in the old days, you have very small firm, 1 or 2 people, or you can have a very big firm with 100 people, right? So some of the answers to these questions might be very obvious to you today, but in the old days, it's very hard because people really don't know what happened within the firm, okay? So we don't know why some firms are big and some are small, and we don't know what factors limit the size of the firm or limit the growth of the firm, okay? And we also don't know why firms adopt different organizational structures. Okay, so all of these issues cannot be observed because at that time, firm is a black box, okay? And the people did not try to understand what's inside the box. Making sense? Yeah? So then let's talk about what is the development, Okay, so what are the modern theories of the firm? So the old theory is that firm is a black box. We only care about input and output. Okay, the modern theory starts from this economist named Coase. Okay, so he is one of the first to look inside to the box. Okay, so his research question is, why are some transactions organized within firms and some other transactions they organize across markets? Okay, so does anyone have an answer here? So when we look at the firm's transactions, some of them are just transactions within the company, right? And a lot of other transactions, they are transactions with other parties in the market, so they are cross markets. So why is that? Well, if you know the answer, you'll be an economist, right? So for us to answer this question, we first need to understand what is the definition of firm, right? So before Coase, there's no commonly accepted definition of what is firm, okay? So these guys, Coase, right? So he defined firms from the contractual relationships between parties to a transaction. Okay? So now we know for every transaction, right? For one transaction, you at least need to have two parties. Yes? So Coase studied the definition of firm from these contractual relationships to a transaction. Okay? So for example, employees and employers. Okay? Therefore, he breaks the black box down into each transactions, right? So he is one of the first to employ transaction as the basic unit of analysis in industrial organization, okay? So he came up with this idea, yes, we define firm as a set of transactions, okay? So for us to study why some transactions are organized within the firm and some of them are organized outside the firm, we have to understand the contractual relationships, okay, between those parties to a transaction. So that's his definition, right? So he defined the firm as a set of transactions over which the normal free market mechanism was suppressed and replaced by authority. Okay, so what does that mean? Let me give you an example, okay? So for example, today, I want someone to help me to do my housework, okay? So on top of my head, I want someone to help me to do my gardening, okay? And I want someone to clean my carpet. I want someone to do my dishes, okay? So I have at least 3 tasks, but there might be some other more housework that I need someone to help me, but currently I only can think of 3 of them, okay? So what can I do? I can post 3 ads on social media, right? So I can have one ad to look for a gardener. I can have one ad to look for someone to do my carpet. And I can have one ad to look for someone to do my dishes, right? So once the 3 ads are up, then basically people will contact me, right? So they'll come to my house, and for each single task, I have to bargain the price with different individuals. Yes? So as you can see, this process will be very time-consuming, and it will be costly to me. Making sense? So that's one option, okay? Or my second option is I only put up one ad, okay? So I'm looking for a cleaner which can work for me for 4 hours to help with my housework. And within the 4 hours, I want to do my carpet, to do my gardening, and also to help my dishes. If you have extra time, please also help me with my bathroom, for example. Okay? So I put up this one ad. I only need to interview a number of cleaners for this one job, and then we bargain once for the price. Making sense? So it saved me time, and it saved me money. And it can also provide me with other benefits. So for example, if the cleaner can finish the 3 tasks in 2 hours, then he can spend the other 2 hours to do other things in my house, right? So it gives me some other benefit which is not specified in the contract. Making sense? So this is the idea, okay? So a set of transactions, a set of tasks, okay, was suppressed and replaced by one person, replaced by authority. Okay, so that's the definition of firm from Coase. Okay, so what I have here is another example, okay? A full-time employee and a part-time employee, okay? So some of you may ask, right? Why organizations will employ part-time employees and also at the same time they will employ part-time employees, right? So I can tell you when I was probably 10 years ago when I was a casual tutor, I was a part-time casual tutor, right? So at that time, my head of school only asked me to do tutorials, okay? And he paid me, let's say, $100 for an hour, okay? But he cannot ask me to do anything beyond that. If he wants me to help with marking, for example, or he wants me to help to give a lecture, he needs to pay me extra. Yes? But now I'm a full-time employee, right? And within my contract with the head, I need to do teaching, I need to do research. So that's my main responsibilities, okay? But within my contract, there might be some other admin duties that I need to do and without paying by the supervisor. So basically the boss says, please go to this function, and I have to go to this function, okay? A lot of time, do I really want to go? Maybe I don't really want to go, right? So same idea here, okay? So the decision to use a full-time employee rather than acquire a part-time employee, right, acquire service from the market for these part-time jobs is due to the lower transaction cost of doing so, okay? So when you contract with a part-time employee for a particular task, when you have multiple tasks, every time you have to bargain, you have to pay for it. So it increases your transaction costs, okay? But when you have a full-time employee, basically you only need to pay once, negotiate once, okay? So it lowers the costs. So this example is very simple, right? So everyone can relate to, but the basic idea is applicable to all the service that a firm requires to effect production, okay? So why we are so care about cost or the contracts or the transactions? Because contracting is a very costly process, okay? So we'll talk about contracts in a minute, okay? So now we talk about coerced definition of firm, right? So it's in 1937, okay? Now the other two economists follow coerce, but they take one step further to define the firm, okay? So coerce defines firms as a set of transactions, right? And Jason and Macklin, okay, in 1976, they described the firm as the nexus of contracts, okay? So you can see the move from transaction to contracts, right? So it's the nexus of contracts between economic individuals, okay? So what is nexus? Nexus is a connection or series of connections linking two or more things, okay? So you can consider firm is a linkage of different or multiple contracts. Does that make sense? So let me give you another example, okay? So I have a contract with my head of school, right? Because I'm an employee. Now, for every lectures in our school will have a contract with the head of school, right? So you can already imagine how many contracts that we will have within a school, right? And these contracts basically tells us what's our responsibility and what we are paid for, right? Now, between the school within CBE, okay, there's also a contract. So what is this contract about? This contract is about how we allocate profits, right? So every school will earn their own revenue, and then they will have a contract with the college in terms of resource allocation. Making sense? Yeah? Now, between colleges and colleges, there are also contracts, okay? So some college may be good at research, but not so good at generate profit, right? And our college, for example, we are very good at generate profit because we have a large student base, okay? But our research may not be as strong as some other college, right? So what we do is we have a contract. So every year, the revenue generated by us will be used to subsidize those colleges who are not so profitable but good at research. So that's another contract, okay? So if you look at ANU as a whole, as an organization, there are many, many contracts for each tier. Making sense? So you can consider ANU is a nexus that connects two or more things, that connects lots of contracts. Making sense? Yep. Okay, so this nexus serves to reduce the number and the complexity of contracts, okay, that need to be written in order for production to take place. So the example, well, you can think of this question yourself, right? So if you want to enter business, go to business with 5 of your friends, okay, how many contracts do you need to write? You can think about it, okay? Now, it's come to contracts. So why do we care how many contracts are needed, okay? And as I mentioned before, it's because the contracting process is very costly, it's very time-consuming, okay? So if we assume other things are equal, right, the more contracts required to facilitate production, the higher these contracts costs, okay? So why contract is so costly? There are a number of reasons, a number of sources actually attribute to the costly process, okay? So first of all, before you can sign a contract with the counterparty, right, you have to acquire the information needed to decide on the desired term of a contract, right? So for example, last year around this time, right, I got a job offer from ANU, right? So before I accept the job offer, I need to think about how I can negotiate a better deal for myself with the head of school, right? So how do I do that? Even before the negotiation, I need to do my own research. I need to search on for example, what is my market value, right? So I need to search for the same status, same level of publication or teaching experience, how much, for example, UNSW will pay, right? I need to, for example, ask my friends in UNSW working in Monash or Melbourne Uni how much they get paid, right? So I need to do my own research so I know what is my market value, right? And then I also need to think about what the counterparty knows. So all the information I possess, do you think the head of school doesn't know? The head of school probably knows that, right? So what is he or she's strategy to negotiate, right, on the negotiation table? So all of these, right, the first dot point here is very costly. It's very time-consuming. Making sense? So then we collect all the information, and then we bring all the information to the negotiation table. Then we play with each other, right, to negotiate for a better deals. So what's my bonus? What's my teaching load? And what is my research requirement, right? So negotiation is very important, right? So once the two parties or more than two parties, right, to the negotiation happy about the terms, then we can start to write up the terms of the deals, okay? Now when you write up the term of the deals, again, it's costly because some contracts may be easy to write, but some other contracts are difficult to write, okay? And a lot of time, you might need a lawyer to step in to look at the terms on the contract. Making sense? So for example, my contract with my tutor is always very simple because the tutor only need to do one thing for me, which is to give tutorials, right? And I pay him or her for a certain amount of money. But as you can imagine, the contract between the head of school and the university will be very complex because the head of school needs to do teaching and research, but there are other things that he or she need to do, right? For example, to manage people, right? To develop strategies for the growth of the school, right? So once the contract have more complex deals, right, written or complex terms, then the cost to write up this contract will increase as well. Making sense? Yeah? Okay, so now we write the deals, right? So we have write up the terms of the contract. So the next step is that once the contract is written, so then both parties happy and they start to fulfill their responsibility, right? So for one party, okay, if he's the one to pay the other party, then he actually needs to know, whether the other party is doing the job correctly, right, or performing the job efficiently. So then we come to the monitor the monitoring stage when we need to monitor performance of the other party. Okay? Again, this process can be very costly. And why is that? Let me give you an example, right? So for example, if I send my car to service, right? So I have a contract with the service provider, the dealer, right? So I want to know if I'm paying $1,000 and I'm actually getting $1,000 service back from the car dealer. So what can I do? I can sit there and observe the technician to check this, check that, check this, and check that. Okay, I can sit there for the whole day, but at the end of the day, I may still have no idea in terms of how well the technician is doing his job. Why? Because I know nothing about car. So I can only observe the technician check the wheels, check other things, check the engine, but I don't really know what he's checking, right? So for the other party to monitor the performance, it requires skills, it requires time, and these are very costly once again, okay? So the whole contracting process is very costly, as you can see, okay? And because of the high costs, firms want to reduce this cost, right? So that's why, well, not the firm, but people want to reduce this cost. That's why we have firm. Making sense? Yeah? Okay. So are all contracts equally costly? And I guess the answer is no, right? Because we've already talked about some of the examples. So contracting costs, okay? If we apply this to organization, right? It's always higher for longer term contracts, okay? Now, the reason is very simple. If we have a short-term contract and let's say a short-term contract for 3 months, okay? If I'm not happy about other parties' performance, I don't need to do anything. I can just wait until the contract expires. So if I'm not happy about the other party's performance, simply I don't renew contract with him, right? I can find another one to do the same, to provide the same service for me, okay, for another 3 months. So that's the cost of breaching or terminate the contract is very low if it's a short term. But if I have a longer term contract with somebody else, let's say 5 years contract with one of the employee, right? And I'm not happy about this employee's performance, what can I do? I can terminate the contract. But before I terminate the contract, I need to give the reasons to the employees why I don't think you are doing well, so I have to terminate your contract. And then I need to pay compensation fees, right, to the other party. So for the longer term contracts, it's always costly, okay? The cost is always higher than the short term contracts, okay? And when there's a great uncertainty about future economic conditions, the contracting cost will be high as well. And why is that? Simply because the party who are paying don't know what will happen in future, whether they will generate enough profit to cover the service they are contracting for, okay? And also when the required behavior is very complex, therefore it is difficult to specify and observe the performance, so you incur higher monitoring costs, okay? And when the contracting party invests long-lived assets, which are specialized to the purpose of the contract, then the contract cost will be high again, simply because the asset, right, the asset that you invest in can only be used for this contract. It cannot be used for other purpose, okay? So we talk about contracts and also the contracting costs. How does that relate to accounting? So accounting information actually plays a very important role here in the organization. And why is that? Because if you look at the contracting process, accounting information are everywhere, right? So first of all, if you go back to the source, right? When you acquire information from the market, when you want to negotiate a better deal, a lot of time you want to use accounting information. So we're talking about a firm setting, right? So if you are the manager, you want to negotiate a higher salary with your superior. then you will use some accounting information to help you to negotiate. Why? You can, for example, talk about your firm's profitability, and then you can compare this with another firm's profitability, and you can establish how well you are, how valuable you are, right? So accounting information plays a role here, and of course the other party will come back and say, yeah, you're just performing average, but then the benchmark will be accounting information. Making sense? And of course, in terms of the payment, the salary, right? So it will be using accounting information, and then the performance target will, in a lot of time, it will be written in accounting numbers or accounting ratios, okay? So accounting information is everywhere, okay? So it's frequently used to cover both internal and external transactions of the firm. Making sense? Yeah? Okay. So this is the theory of firm. So what is a firm? Firm is a set of contracts, right? So that's the modern theory of the firm. Okay, now let's talk about agency theory. Same article, okay, from the same economists, Jensen and McLean. So Jensen and McLean define what is a firm, right? So they say these are contractual relationships between the parties to one transaction, right? So it covers the relationship, it also covers the contract. So what we've just went through about the contracts itself, but now let's have a look at the relationships, okay? So Jensen and McLean, they actually study the different incentives prevailing in a 100% owner management firm and one in which the manager only owns less than 100% of the business. So Jensen and McLean came up with this idea called agency theory, okay? So basically, when you look at a relationship with two parties, okay, the shareholders and the manager. We said the shareholders are the owners of the company, right? So they are actually the principal. So they hire the manager to organize the firm, to operate the firm for them. So the manager is acting as an agent to the principal. Making sense? And this agency relationship actually happens everywhere. It doesn't necessarily to be in a firm. If today I give you $5 and ask you to pay to buy a coffee for me, then you are my agent, right? Now, if you are going to actually deliver the coffee to me, or you are going to take the $5 and run away, this is something that the principal cannot control, right? Well, or I can put down some mechanism to monitor performance and make your incentive to be the same or to be aligned with my incentive, but this is something we'll talk about later, okay? So the agency relationship is everywhere, okay? So it happens when the principal delegates the decision authority to the agent. Making sense? So then the agent is act on behalf of the principal, okay? So Jensen and McLean, they talk about this relationship, and then they said there will be different incentives of the agent. Okay, and this incentive for the agent to act in the interest of the principal varies depending on how much ownership that the manager has in the firm. Making sense? So he gave you two scenarios. The first scenario is that the owner and the manager, they are the same guy. So there's a 100% owner-managed firm. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario is that the manager owns less than 100% of the business. So the example here is the manager owns just 50% of the firm. Okay? So if we look at the first scenario, when the manager owns 100% of the firm, okay, effectively he is the owner of the firm, so he enjoys all the benefits generated from the business. Yes? And he also bears all the costs of the business. So if the manager is very hardworking and he owns 100%, then all the benefit generated from the firm will be enjoyed by him. But on the other side, if the manager is very lazy, okay, and incur a lot of costs, then his or her will bear all the costs, right? So that's the first scenario. As you can see, the manager's incentive is the same as the firm incentive because he is the owner. Making sense? Now, the situation will be different, okay? If the manager just owns 50% of the firm, Okay? So if they only own 50% of the firm, they actually only suffer 50% of the financial cost of being slacking. Okay? But still get 100% of the benefit of being a lazy slug. And why we say that? Because the owners who are own 50%, they delegate the decision right to the manager. So the owner are outside to the firm. Does that make sense? So if I put everything into a graph like this, okay? So we are now talking about the second scenario when the owners, okay, so two guys over here, they put in 50% into the firm, and the manager on the other side put in another 50%, okay? Now, logically or in theory, you would think if the firm makes $100 profit, right? How is $100 profit distributed? $50 will go to the shareholders and $50 go to the manager, right? And on the other hand, if the firm makes $100 loss, then shareholders bear $50 and the managers bear another $50 loss, in theory, right? But now, in practice, it may not happen. And why is that? Because the manager can tell the shareholders, we actually made $200 loss instead of $100. So we actually made $100, but the manager tell the shareholders we made $200 loss in last financial year. So the shareholders will bear $100 loss, and from the figure, the managers will bear $100 loss, but in fact, the whole $100 loss go to the shareholders, the manager bears nothing. Making sense? So that's one way. Or the manager can, if the company is making $100 loss, but at the same time they are making $100 profit, let's say $100 revenue, the manager can take this $100 into his or her own pocket without letting the shareholders know. Making sense? So the manager will still be able to benefit from the firm for last financial year. Making sense? Now, a lot of time, when the manager, let's say, hide the profit from the shareholders, okay, they don't need to actually put that into his own bank account, okay? So what this manager can do is to spend this $100, let's say, buy a very expensive leather couch in the office, okay, using this $100. So the key point Jason and Macklin want to say from this example is that when you look at this situation, how the manager is able to do that is because managers are insiders and the owners are outsiders, right? So as an insider, the manager always possesses more information than the outsiders, right? And the outsiders will not be able to observe what is really going on within the firm. Making sense? So the principal cannot actually monitor the agent's behavior effectively. Making sense? So this situation, we have an official term. We call this information asymmetry. Okay, now you might have heard of this term before. Information asymmetry basically says the information, the two parties are getting imbalanced information. Okay, so the insiders possess more information than the outsiders. So when the outsiders are lack of information, they cannot make the decision effectively. Making sense? So we talk about this information asymmetry. Okay, so related to that, okay, there are two key behavioral problems. Okay, so one is called moral hazard. So what do we mean by moral hazard? The agent may adopt courses of actions that harm the principal because the principal's ability to observe the agent's behavior is imperfect. Okay, so we are talking about this situation, right? So the manager hides this $100 and the agent will not be able to tell because they don't know what's going on. They cannot observe the manager's behavior. So this is a moral hazard problem. And the second problem is called adverse selection. Okay, so what do we mean by adverse selection? It's also derived from information asymmetry because the agent may adopt course of action that harm the principal because the agent cannot observe all the agent's possible course of action perfectly. So let me give you an example, right? So consider yourself are investors of a big corporation, okay? And I am the CEO, okay? And we are about to make an investment decision in one of the countries, okay? So at the general meetings, okay, I tell you, I evaluate all the options, okay? And I think the best investment decision will be we invest a factory in China, okay? Because China, this particular location is very good, have very low labor costs, blah, blah, blah. So I consider China is the best investment option, okay? Now, as investors, you might ask me, but do we have other investment options? Can we invest in other countries, okay? And I can tell you, no, we don't. China is our best option, okay? Even though I know I also evaluate the investment opportunities in India, in Malaysia, and in other countries. And these countries give me equivalent benefits afterwards, okay? But I can tell you, no, we don't have other option, we only have China. As an investor, you have to believe me, right? Because you rely on the information I provided to you. But in fact, you don't know, you cannot observe how many options I actually have. So why I tell you China is the best option? Because I have my self-interest. I want to enjoy a holiday in China every year, for example. That's why I'm telling you China is the best investment option. Best investment option because every year I need to spend, let's say, 2 months in the Chinese factory. Okay? So this example is called adverse selection. As a principle, you cannot observe all the possible causes, okay, of action perfectly. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So once again, it's an information symmetry problem. As a CEO, I have more information than you. Okay? So then Jensen and McLean continues. Okay? So we have this agency problem, right? The manager and the agent possess different information. Okay? So the manager has private information. Okay? So the investors, right? You guys, you are not stupid, right? So you can actually foresee or predict this incentive problem that I have based on the description that we just had, right? Because you are all having, certain financial background. So you can predict I have this incentive problem. And remember the very beginning we talk about the assumption underlying positive accounting theory, right? So you actually need to be aware of that I have my own interest. Okay? So, as an investor, what you do, right? So you will then expect the effort supplied by me to fall as managerial ownership levels in the firm fall, right? So if I own 80% of the firm, my incentive to work for the firm's interest probably is still high, but when my ownership within the firm falls to 20%, then my interest to work for the firm's interest will be very low, right? So the investor will then expect the effort supplied by me to fall as my ownership levels in the firm fall, okay? And these have a consequence. So what is the consequence? The consequence is that the investor will then perceive the manager's interest is in conflict of their interest, of the firm interest. Therefore, they will reduce the amount that they are prepared to pay for a share in the firm. Does that make sense to you? So the investors have this perception that the managers has incentive, okay, to act on their own interest. So to overcome this problem, so if they don't trust managers will work for the shareholders' interest, what they do, they reduce their amount of investment into the firm. Making sense? So if the firm wants to attract the same level of capital, they actually have to raise the cost of equity. Right? So the cost for the firm to attract equity will become higher because of the investor's perception of management incentive problem. Making sense? So this is the example used by Jensen and McLean to illustrate, right? So what is the consequence of this agency relationship? Okay? So it's using the equity provider as an example. Okay, so let me give you another example which focuses on the debt provider. Okay, so we also have debt provider, right? So if today you want to deposit $1,000 okay? And you have two choices, okay? So Commonwealth Bank says if you deposit $1,000 for a 2 years period, I will give you an interest rate of 5%, okay? Now, there's another option, which is a small bank funded by me, okay? And I said to you, if you put your $1,000 into my bank, I will give you an interest rate of 5.5%. Which bank will you choose to deposit your money? You probably will go to Commonwealth Bank, right? Because Commonwealth Bank is large, right? It's more credible. And as a small bank funded by me, you never know if I will take your money in the wrong way. Yes? But now, if I'm telling you, yes, Commonwealth Bank provides you 5% interest, okay? So for me to attract your deposit, if you put this $1,000 in my bank, I will give you a 20% interest. So my interest rate is 20% after 2 years. Are you going to put your money into my bank? Some of you say no, but there are some investors who are seeking high return. They probably will put the money into my bank. Yes? So what's the consequence for me? So as the bank, right, in 2 years' time, I have to pay you, return deposit to you, and I have to pay you 20% interest. So my cost of borrowing actually increased, right? Because I want to mitigate your perception on me, right? Because I'm a small bank, I'm not so credible. So to mitigate this problem, I still want to attract your investment. I increase my interest rate. And the increase of the interest rate have an immediate impact on me because it increased my cost of borrowing. Making sense? So this is another example from the debt holder's perspective, but we're talking about the same thing, okay? So when the investor perceive management have incentive problem, the cost of capital increase for the firm, okay, to attract investment. And then once again, firms are not stupid, right? Firm can actually predict investor will have this perception and this consequential behavior. So what do? They then need to signal to the market, to the investor, okay? Yes, we all know that you think we have incentive problem, but I can tell you our manager's incentive problem is not that severe because our firm engage in monitoring and bonding activities. Okay? So you look at this, right? It's very funny. It's actually in a loop. So the investors knows that the management will have incentive problem, but the managers actually investors know they have incentive problem. So what they do is they tell the investor, don't worry. Okay, we have this monitoring and the bonding activities to reduce the agency cost. Okay? All right, so we'll talk about the monitoring and the bonding activities after the break. Okay, so we have a lot of things to cover today, so I'll give you 5 minutes break, and when we come back, we'll talk about these activities to reduce the agency cost. Okay, so let's start again. Right, so before the break, we said the firm want to actually signal to the user, to the investor, right? So they have this incentive problem being taken care of, okay, by engaging these monitoring and bonding activities, okay? So we'll briefly talk about what they are, and then we'll come back later to talk about the details in terms of what do we do in monitoring and what do we do in bonding, okay? So first of all, bonding activities, okay? Not bonding, sorry. Monitoring activities. Monitoring includes the mechanism by which the performance of the agent is monitored by the principal, okay? And the principal being the outsider equity holder. Making sense? Yeah? So we said, right, for a contract to be valid and to achieve its purpose, the other side, who are paying the money, they actually need to monitor the performance, right, of the agent, okay? So it's the same thing here. The principal want to monitor the performance of the agent, and in fact, if you look at the corporate failures that we discussed in week 1, those corporate failures, one of the biggest reasons for this corporation to fail is because the managers, the CEO, CFO, at that time, they act opportunistically. They pursue for their own interest, right? So now we understand why the monitoring is so important. And in fact, after 2002, there's a lot of regulatory reform on the corporate governance mechanism, okay? So corporate governance is considered as a monitoring mechanism, okay, since the collapse of the major companies, okay? So what is it? It's a set of systems or by which the companies are directed and controlled, okay? So now you might have heard of these mechanisms. So for example, the board of directors, the audit committee, internal control system, yeah? Information system, accounting information system. So all of these are considered as one mechanism under the corporate governance system, okay, to help the outsider, the principal, to monitor the performance of the agent or to constrain the behavior of the managers. Making sense? So if you're interested in corporate governance, because it's a very rich area for research, okay, you go to Google Scholar, you type in, for example, corporate governance and earnings management. There will be tons of research papers on those topics, okay? So in the United States, right, after 2002, after the regulatory reform, all the listed companies need to comply with one act called Sarbanes-Oxley Act 2002, okay? It specifies what a firm should do, what a listed firm should do to manage their managers' behavior, for example, okay? And it talks, and in Australia we have the same thing. You might have heard of ASX best practice or Club 9. Have you heard of that? Okay. So in Australia we have these 8 principles which recommend for best practice that a listed company in Australia need to, well, basically recommended to have, okay? So these best practice recommendations accompany each of these principles, okay? So a listed firm in Australia, if they do not adapt one of these principles, they need to explain to the investor, they need to explain to the ASIC why they do not adapt, okay? So can't remember the details of this 8 principle, but I think there's one principle says you need to have a board of directors, right? And on the board of directors, you need to have an audit committee, for example, okay? And we'll talk about why we need to have that in a minute. But these are something that suggested by ASX in terms of the corporate governance, okay, system. So this is monitoring, okay? Now, as you can see, monitoring is from the outsider, okay? So the outside can actually have a huge investment in corporate governance. They can actually recruit a lot of people to supervise managers' behavior, okay? But do you think it will be effective? A lot of time, you can have all these rules, you have these policies laid down, but it may not be that effective. And why? Because managers, once again, have the power to override some of these policies. when their incentives are not aligned with the shareholders' incentive. Okay, so monitoring is one mechanism, and bonding is another important mechanism. So what do we mean by bonding? Bonding means we try to directly align the manager's interest to the firm's interest. And how do we do that? We design compensation contracts. And when we design the compensation contracts for the managers, we put their incentive in. Okay, so you might heard of incentive contracts, you might heard of bonus scheme, you might heard of employees option scheme. So these are all the binding mechanisms try to directly align the interests of the agent. So the underlying idea is very simple. Okay, so I give you some ownership of the firm. So I gave the manager the shares, for example, or I tell you that if you beat the performance target, you'll be paid bonus. Okay, so at the end of the day, the shareholders will get their return on the company if the company is performing well, but the managers also enjoys their own benefit from the company's performance. Okay, because then they have a motive, they have incentive to keep pushing the company share price up, for example. Making sense? So this is the basic idea of bonding. Okay, and then we'll talk about these bonding mechanisms later. So now we talk about what's the role of accounting in reducing this agency cost. Okay, so if we look at financial statement actually represents a form of monitoring mechanism. And why it's a monitoring mechanism? Because the numbers that you see on the financial statement represents how well the manager performed in the last financial year end. It's very obvious if you look at this year's earnings number and you try to compare this with last year. Immediately you can tell if the manager is doing a good job in this year or not, right? So if the earnings increase, the manager is doing well. If the earnings decrease, then you may question the manager's work in the last financial year. So the financial statement itself represents a form of monitoring, okay? But of course, it's not enough, right? So that's why you need to have other mechanism to go with that. So accounting data, okay, is incorporated in the terms of managerial incentive contracts and the bonus scheme. Okay, so when we look at this binding mechanism, when you design the incentive contracts, bonus scheme, and option scheme, okay, a lot of time you'll have a performance condition specified in these different contracts. Okay, and these performance conditions, these performance targets are normally in accounting form. Okay, so for example, I want you to, so for example, the manager, for example, for him or her to achieve a bonus of 200% of its salary, his or her salary, they need to make sure the share price increase by 20% in the next 2 years. Okay, so the design of these contracts is using accounting data. Okay. Now, as what I'm saying here, this often creates another incentive problem for its own. Why? Because managers are the one provide accounting information, right? And on the other hand, their incentive contracts are written using this information. So as you can see, the manager, if they pursue their self-interest, then they can actually manipulate the information so that they will get a better deal in terms of their own compensation contract. Does that make sense? Yeah? So we'll come back to this point, okay? All right, so that's the agency relationship in general between manager and shareholders, okay? But there are also other agency relationships. For example, the partnership, each partner is an agent of each other partner, right? And also when we talk about an organization, right, there are other agency relationships such as the employer and the employee, the subordinates and the superior, okay? So now we come back to Jensen and McLean, right, in terms of firm structure. So why we have different structures within the firm, right, for different firms. So, and how the firm structure is related to agency cost, okay? Now you can see because we've already covered touched on corporate governance, right? So the board of directors, different layers of managers, right? All of these actually serve a role to reduce the agency cost because they are monitoring mechanism, right? But back in 1970s, right, when Jensen and McLean, when they wrote their article, their analysis only focused on a firm with a single level of management, because they want to tell you what is a firm, they want to tell you the agency relationship. So for them to explain this relationship to you, they use a very simple structure, which is a firm with a single level of management, okay? But that does not apply to the corporations in modern, well, basically these days, because these days companies tend to be very large. Okay, they have multiple layers of management, multiple layers of control mechanisms. Okay, so what do we do nowadays? Okay, so we accept the idea from Jensen and McLean. Okay, firm structure will help to reduce the agency cost because of the monitoring function. Okay, so what do we do in modern organization? We try to separate the management, the decision management right from the decision control right. Okay, so remember earlier we said the agency relationship exists because the principal delegate the decision-making right or decision-making authority to the managers, right? But for this decision right to be delegated to the managers, it actually can be further separated. Okay, so now we want to separate the management right from the control right. Okay, and why is that? Simply because the information asymmetry, once again, okay? When your organization becomes larger, the economic distance between the principal and the agent become larger, okay? So the agents possess lots of inside information and the outsider doesn't know, okay? So let me give you an example, right? So we all heard of board of directors, right? So the board of directors exists for a reason, okay? Because it helps the principal to constrain managers' opportunistic behavior, okay? So this is just an example of board of directors, okay? So typically in US these days, if the company is a large company, they have this board of directors normally comprise, let's say, 10 to 12 people, okay? It could be larger, it could be smaller. There's a lot of research on what will be the optimal size for the board of directors, okay? So we don't have an answer for now, but the example I'm putting here is, let's say, a board of directors of 10 to 12 people, okay? Now you can see, if you consider this as a table, right? On the left-hand side is the executive directors. So what do we mean by executive directors? These are the CEOs, CFO, or sometimes it could be the CEO, the chief operating officer, okay? These are the guys managing the company on a daily basis. Making sense? So these are actually the senior managers, senior management, okay? Now on the other side of the table, you have these non-executive directors, okay? So what are they? They are part-time employees, okay? It could be university professors, it could be large investors, it could be some other interested parties, okay? It could be a trust fund, it could be a charity fund, okay? So these guys, they are part-time employees. So let's take the university professor, for example, okay? So he probably works in this firm 2 days a week, 2 days at university, and then 1 day in another company, okay? So these non-exec directors, because they're part-time, they don't actually know what's going on in the firm on a daily basis, right? So, but how do we get these non-exec directors? First of all, they need to have ownership into the company, right? So they are actually shareholders, and they are elected by shareholders. Okay, so the management rights goes to the CEO, CFO, go to these senior managers, okay? And the control rights go to these non-executive directors or the board of directors as a whole. Making sense? So what is a management right? So managers are assigned a decision management right, okay? So managers are responsible for initiating projects. Okay, so as an investor, you put money into the company, and you want the manager to use your money to make more money, basically, right? So how do we do that? They need to initiate profitable projects, okay? So they seek out profitable ventures for the firm to invest in, okay? But before they can put this into implementation, they have to go back to the board of directors to convince these non-executive directors that this project is profitable, it's good for investors, okay? So they need to wait until the board of directors approve these projects so that they can carry this project, okay? They can start to implement this project. Making sense? Yeah? So this is called decision management rights. Every time when the manager initiates an important project, they need to get it approved by the board of directors first, okay? So on the other hand, for this board of directors, okay, they possess these control rights, okay? So they actually approve or disapprove the project before the manager implement them, okay? And afterwards, they monitor the manager's behavior, right? So according to the implementation, according to the outcome, they then award or punish the managers for their performance. Making sense? Yeah? So now you can see, because we have these guys here, we have the control right separated from the management right, the manager's opportunistic behavior is constrained. Making sense? Yeah? Okay. Now, in theory, okay, when we talk about board of directors, in theory, ideally, the board of directors should all be shareholders. The managers, the CEO, CFO, should not be on the board of directors, in theory. Why is that? Because simply the board's primary job is to supervise, right? To oversee managers' behavior. Making sense? So the board's primary job is to represent the rights of shareholders, okay? Therefore, they are elected by the shareholders. They reward or punish managers' behavior, okay? But in reality, it's never going to happen because these guys, as you can see, okay, they are only part-time employees. They don't know about the company very well. So they need someone sitting on the board to explain to them what is going on. Making sense? So nowadays, in a lot of companies' boards, okay, CEO is always on the board. Okay? Sometimes CFO is always on the board, but again, there's tons of research talk about what is the best composition of the board of directors. How many executive directors that you need to have on your board so that your board will still acting in its primary role, which is supervising the managers. Okay? So there's a lot of research on that. There's no final conclusion yet on how many executive directors should be on the board. Okay? Now, one thing these days are very obvious from research is that the CEO cannot chair the board. So you might have heard of CEO duality in your other courses. So if you are doing auditing, right, you might have heard of CEO duality on the board might be a problem. Why? If the CEO at the same time is also the chairman of the board, the CEO possesses dominant power of the board. Okay? And then this actually reduce the power of non-executive directors, so it reduced the ability for the board to supervise CEO's behavior. Okay? So this is something currently has already been established by the literature. When you see CEO at the same time is also chairman of the board, it means the board of this particular company is not that independent from the managers. Okay? All right, so that's corporate governance. Yeah, we've already talked about that. So this, therefore, is a two-level structure, okay? And the board regular review managers' behavior, and the audit committee these days, okay, is also very important. So audit committee is a subset of board of directors. So audit committee regularly review the financial or accounting reports, okay, or the accounting-related matters provided by the management, okay? So the board, for them to fully understand, to exercise their responsibility, they need to actually possess adequate financial expertise okay, to represent shareholders' interest. So I can give you one example. Back in 2005, okay, National Bank of Australia went through a lot of serious financial problems. Okay, so then the ASIC looked at the board of the bank, and they found out none of the board member actually has financial or accounting expertise. Okay, so none of them actually possess, let's say, CEA or CPA or CA qualifications at that time. So what do? So the shareholders sacked the whole board. Okay, because the board at that time basically did not function well in supervising the manager's behavior. They don't have the financial or accounting related expertise. Okay, so that's corporate governance, board of directors. Okay, now you might find other corporate governance mechanisms, for example, internal control system, the remuneration committee, and all sorts of other committees. Okay, so you can have your own reading after class. But now let's talk about the other very important mechanism, which is the bonding mechanism. So we mentioned earlier, right? You can spend a lot of time to design this monitoring mechanism, but at the end of the day, your manager may still not act in your interest because they have their own interest. Okay? So how do we do that? We design bonding mechanism, try to align managers' interest with your interest. So we try to provide enough incentive for managers to work to identify good projects to work for shareholders' interest. Okay? How do they do that? Okay? They can, so the firm these days, or in old days, they have these bonus schemes. Okay? So we'll talk about these in more details next week. Or they can give managers shares in the company, or give managers call options on shares. Okay? So I will talk about these two today, and I'll leave the bonus scheme to next week. So, for us to align managers' interest with the shareholders' interest, we can simply give managers ordinary shares of the firm, right? So it provides incentive for manager to identify good projects they expect to increase the share price. So when the share price increase, shareholders benefit, the manager's own wealth will also increase, right? So it sounds very good. Yeah? And it actually used a lot in practice. However, it creates another form of agency problem. And why is that? Let me explain, okay? So if you are investor of, let's say, company X, okay? And when the company share falls, you suffer loss, right? But I think you all have done some finance study, right? You know, for investor, if you want to diversify your risk, how do you do it? You diversify your investment portfolio, right? So you purchase these company shares, but you also purchase shares from other companies, right? So you don't put all your eggs into one basket. That's what we said, right? In diversification. So you purchase some shares in this company, but you purchase some other shares in other companies. So when the share of one company falls, you make a loss, but you can always use the gain that you make from other companies to offset against this loss. So your loss as a result of the share price of this particular company is not that severe, simply because you can diversify this risk from your diversified investment portfolio. Making sense? No. Managers is different, okay? Managers also invest in companies. So, but what do they invest? They invest in their human capital, right? So when the company falls, the manager suffer loss, right? Because if the manager are receiving shares from this company as compensation, when the company share price fall, the manager lose money. So they lose money, they may lose reputation because they are not managing the firm well. They lose money, they lose reputation, they may lose their current job, they may also lose their future jobs, okay? Managers can actually not diversify this risk to other parties. Making sense? Unlike investors, they can invest in multiple companies. Manager can only work for one company full-time, right? So they cannot diversify this risk, okay? And this risk because it's so specific to the company, and we call this unsystematic risk. Okay? So managers cannot diversify this risk, so they are actually worried about this unsystematic risk. So what if the company is not doing so well and the share price fall in future, right? Because of my investment decision. So managers, therefore, are actually risk averse. So they are more conservative than the shareholders, than the investors, simply because shareholders can diversify the risk. Making sense? So what's the consequence? The consequence is that managers, therefore, may not want to engage in those high-risk projects, even though the high risk will provide you high return. High-risk project will provide you high return, but it will also provide you huge loss in future. You never know that, okay? So managers' risk preference is not aligned with the investors' risk preference. So they may choose not to invest in those projects. Making sense? That you like, but the manager doesn't like. So because of this problem, as you can see, the managers may not tell the investor all the investment options. So then we come back to the adverse selection problem, right? Managers only tells you what they think you should know, but they don't present you with all the options. Making sense? So this creates another incentive problem by giving the shares, by giving manager ordinary shares, okay, to try to incentivize them to work harder for the firm. All good? Yeah? Yeah, so we talk about this. Okay, so now we know the risk preference for the investors and the managers are not aligned. They are not the same, okay? And we know that giving the ordinary shares to the managers may have problem, create this risk alignment problem. So what do? So then the investors say, okay, then I'm not giving you shares directly, okay? I'm going to give you options. So many firms then give their managers the right to buy shares at a predetermined price at some future date. So we call this call option, okay? So what does that mean is, for example, the firm can issue a call option to their managers, okay? So allow the manager to purchase 100 shares in this company at $30 each in 2 years' time. Okay, so the share price of this company might be $20 now, but I will allow the manager, I give the manager the right to purchase 100 shares at $30 in 2 years' time. Okay, and then what happens? If the share price of this company increased to $40 after 2 years, okay, then the manager can actually exercise this option because they have the right. So they can actually buy the shares at $30, and then they immediately sell these shares to the market. So they make a gain of $10 for each share. So this is the direct benefit go to the manager if the share price is $40. Does that make sense? Yeah? However, if the share price dropped to $20, the manager can simply not to exercise this right, and they will not have direct loss. Making sense? So as you can see, these options are designed to align the risk preference of managers. So the managers is able to recoup the benefit, but they don't actually suffer direct loss from the downside risk of the firm performance. So if the firm is not performing well, they can simply let the call option expire. But if the company is performing well, they make a gain by exercising this option. Making sense? So the manager will still have this incentive to make the company performing well, to keep pushing the share price, okay? Because their own wealth will also increase if the share price increase. Happy about this? Call option sounds very good, right? But once again, it creates a new form of agency cost. Okay, so this is not that important. So these options need to be expensed, okay, according to the standards. So given employee or given managers these options, even though can help you to reduce the risk alignment problem, but it creates a new form of agency cost. And why is that? So if we go back to this example, right? So which which number or which figure matters the most in this contract? It's the exercise price, right? So the exercise price is a key number here, right? Because it's predetermined by the board of directors and the managers. It's written in the contract, okay? So if I change this exercise price to $20, okay? Now you compare a $20 contract with a $30 contract. Which one is easy for the manager? It will be the $20 contract for the manager, right? Because if the contract is written in the $20, if I work hard, I push the share price to $40, I can make a gain of $20. Or I don't work so hard, I still have the incentive to push the share price, but I don't work as hard as I should have. The share price, let's say, is $25, I can still make $5 gain, right? 2 years later. So the exercise price is very important, and the managers actually can influence this contract. Why? Because they have more information about the market, about the firm performance, than the board of directors, than the outsiders. Okay? So for example, before the negotiation, if I'm a CEO, I know the board of directors is going to negotiate my compensation with me in two weeks' time. Okay, so what can I do? I can simply spread a rumor, right? So I can tell everybody, we are not doing so well. The industry is tough, the market is tough. Therefore, in 2 years, I don't think our firm will benefit from the industry or benefit from the new technology. So I can create this impression that the firm performance in the next 2 years will not be so great. Okay, therefore, I will be able to negotiate an easy target for me with the board of directors. Does that make sense? So what we are saying here is it's a new form of agency cost simply because the managers have incentive to influence the number and the terms of option granted to them, and they can do it because they control the information. All good? Yeah? All right. So these are the bonding schemes and monitoring schemes. Okay, so what are the specific agency problem, managerial incentive problem? Okay, there's a lot of incentive problems in the literature. Okay, but we are going to focus on 4 of them. We'll talk about 2 today, and then now we've already talked about 1, and I'm going to talk about the first 2 in a minute, and then we'll leave the compensation package to next week. Okay, so one particular incentive problem, okay, managerial incentive problem, is this called excessive dividend retention. So what do we mean by that? Okay, again, we have to talk about in theory, in pure terms. Okay, when the investor give you money, invest money into a firm, they would expect the manager to use your money to invest in positive NPV projects, because this is how you generate more money. You create more money, right? So managers should reinvest the funds in the positive NPV projects, but when there are no remaining positive NPV projects, the balance of available funds should actually be returned to shareholders as a form of dividend. So for example, shareholders give me $10 million. I use $8 million to invest in those positive NPV projects. Okay, so the difference, the $2 million, is unused funds, and in theory, I should return these $2 million to you as dividend. Okay, but in practice, it's not what happened. Okay, so the managers, they have that incentive to retain these $2 million. They do not distribute this. They do not give these $2 million back to you as dividend. They keep this $2 million for other purpose. Okay. So one example is actually from the mergers and acquisitions in 20s and the 90s, 80s and 90s in United States. Okay, so in 80s and the 90s in the United States, there's a lot of mergers and acquisitions. So what are mergers and acquisitions? Consolidations, right? So one firm purchases another firm. There's a lot of these kind of activities. Okay. So then the research tried to understand why in this period we have so many mergers and acquisitions and why firms become bigger and bigger. Okay? Then they look into these mergers and acquisitions. They found a lot of these mergers and acquisitions does not actually add value to the firm. But why they still do that? Because, okay, the CEO at that time, they probably feel personal satisfaction by building up large corporations. So we call this empire building. Okay? So CEO might simply like to become a CEO of a big corporation. It feels powerful, it feels good. Okay, so personal satisfaction, or by work for big corporations, they are able to increase their personal profile. Okay, so once again, we talk about this systematic risk, right? So CEO are binded to this one particular firm. So if the firm is not doing well, they cannot diversify, right? But this is one way for them to diversify. If they can argue that they have worked for big corporations, it actually increases their market value in the labor market. Okay, so these CEOs then use this excess fund or the available funds, which should have been distributed as dividend, but they don't. They retain these funds, and then they start to carry on these mergers and acquisition, okay, for their own purpose. So this is one example for the incentive problem. Does that make sense? So the other problem is called horizon problem. Okay? So what is horizon problem? It relates to the age of the CEO, and what's the risk appetite of the CEO at that time. Okay, so if you are, let's say, 54 years old, okay, you are the CEO of the company, and you intend to retire next year, okay, and the firm you are working for is a pharmaceutical firm, okay. So in this year, for example, your head of research department tells you we have a very good project about a new drug, okay? And this drug will bring us huge benefit because it can cure cancer, okay? So, but we need to have, let's say, 1 billion investment in this new drug this year to conduct these research and development activities. However, the drugs will be successfully developed in 10 years' time. Okay, so it's a long-term project with very good future, but because we are about to retire next year, are you going to invest in this project or not? So the research actually found a lot of CEOs at that time in the United States, they will avoid this kind of project. Why? Because there's no short-term payoff to the CEO. So if you invest in these new drugs, okay? The benefit, if the drug is successfully developed, right, in 10 years, so the benefit will come in 10 years, not immediately. And in 10 years, if the drug is successful, bring huge benefits to the company, you are not the one who take the credits. You do not enjoy the payoff. But before that, you have to put in 1 million investment, and this 1 million investment is R&D expense. It was sitting on your income statement in the current year. It doesn't look good to the board of directors, right? So a lot of CEOs at that time, because of their self-incentive, they want to avoid these long-term projects. Making sense? So this is horizon problem, okay? So what we are saying is that only if the information, the profitability of this long-term project can be signaled to the market without huge cost. Otherwise, the CEO will not carry on this project immediately because they do not enjoy the short-term payoff. Making sense? Yeah? So this is what found in this paper, okay? So what I'm saying here is that we talk about the market, right? So the investors, whether the investors will recognize your effort in these long-term projects, okay? So if the market is efficient, so we talk about this efficient market hypothesis, and we'll come back to this in week 6, okay? The share market should reward all positive NPV projects undertaken regardless of duration. But in reality, our market is never efficient. Okay, so our market, in fact, is only semi-efficient. Okay, therefore the share market is unable to react to this information. Okay, so they are unable to capture the long-term profitability of these positive long-term NPV projects, so that the benefit cannot be enjoyed on the first day. Making sense? Yeah? Okay. So managers may reject the profitable investment. So this is a horizon problem. Okay, so this is about the shareholders and the managers' relationship. Okay, so in the next few slides, let me quickly talk about the other agency problem which exists between the shareholders and the debt holders. Okay, so what we've just done is the shareholders and the manager. Okay, now let's have a look at the other agency relationship, shareholders and debt holders. Okay, so why there is an agency relationship? Okay, if you are the creditor, when you lend money to a firm, effectively to all the shareholders, right? You actually surrender the discretionary control over these funds. So if you lend $1 million to the firm, you let the firm to do whatever they want to do with this 10 million. You don't have the controls anymore, right? So then you'll have this agency relationship. You are the principal, the firm is your agent. Okay, so they control the firm. Sorry, they control the money that you lend to them. Okay? So in return, what do you get? As a creditor, you get the interest revenue specified in the agreement, right? In the borrowing agreement. So the return to you as a creditor are partially a function of the investment behavior of the agent. Okay? So what do I mean by that? Let me give you a simple example. Okay? Now, consider you are creditors. Okay? You actually lend me, let's say, $10 million. 10 million? Yeah, $10 million. Okay? And I'm a small firm, right? So I borrow $10 million from you, but I'm actually is only one shareholder of this firm. So what do I invest initially? I only invest $1 into this firm, but I'm a shareholder, right? Because I invest. So my firm borrowed $10 million from you guys, okay? And we agreed the borrowing terms, the interest rate, blah, 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 okay? So you as the investor, you as the creditors, you are worried, right? So what are you worried about? You're worried if the firm has the ability to pay you back in 2 years' time, the principal plus the interest, right? But as a shareholder, do I worry? I don't worry so much, right? Because if the company fail, I only lose $1 at most, because that's what I'm initially putting in, because my firm is a limited liability firm. Making sense? Yeah? This is what we're saying on these slides, okay? Because as a shareholder, I only lose $1, but as a creditor, if the firm fail, you may lose 10 million as a whole, okay? So once again, we have an incentive. Our interests are not aligned. We have an incentive problem. Making sense? Yeah? So why this incentive will be a problem, okay? So if I'm also the manager of this firm, okay, even though I put in $1 because I'm very capable, I'm the manager, I can take your $10 million and I go to casino, right? So I gamble all the money, I gamble $10 million, okay? At best, I win, let's say, I win 20 millions. Yeah, I win 20 millions, so what I do, I will pay you $10 million back immediately, but I enjoy the other 10 million. Yes, so it's a very risky behavior for me, okay? I go to the casino, I put all the money in, 10 million in, and then at the end of the day, I get $20 million back. I repay you 10 million, and I enjoy the other 10 million. Now, at worst, I lose all the 10 million, okay? So I won't be able to pay you, so you lose your 10 million plus interest, I only lose $1. Yeah? So clearly there's an incentive problem here, and me as the firm, I can actually take more risky investment decisions. I can actually invest in more risky projects because I don't suffer huge loss and you bear all the loss for the money that you lend to me. Making sense? Yeah? And once again, as a creditor, you are not stupid, right? So you know that I will engage in those opportunistic behavior to invest in those very risky projects without huge loss. So what you do, you want to put constraints on me. You want to constrain my risky behavior, right? So then we come back to the debt covenant that we discussed in week 1, remember? So the debt covenant said, put down all the conditions to restrict my behavior. So these restrictions are normally presented in the accounting ratio, okay, in the form of accounting ratio. So for example, the maximum DE ratio, how much you can actually borrow. The more you borrow, the more your financial risk will be, and the more likely that you're going to fail, right? So we want to restrict on your ability to future borrowings, and we want to specify, for example, the minimum interest coverage ratio. I want to make sure that every year you have enough cash flow to cover my interest, okay? So the loan covenant is therefore designed to restrict the risk-taking behavior of the firm, of the borrower, okay? And these loan covenant, these restrictions is actually reviewed regularly by the creditors. Making sense? Yeah? Okay, now, accounting information, therefore, is very important here, right? Accounting information is often incorporated into such restrictive contractual terms, and the purpose is to limit risk-taking behavior of the borrower, okay? But once again, there will be an incentive problem. There will be an agency problem here. Why? Because it's the borrower providing all this accounting information, right? So we talk about Enron's problem in week 1. So even though Enron was not manipulating any numbers, but they are actually choosing the accounting method to account for their investment in SP in a favorable way to the borrower, but not to the lenders, right? So the managers, again, have the ability to control this accounting information. They have the ability to make these debt covenants satisfied, but in reality, they're probably not. Making sense? Yeah? Okay. So this slide just to give you some ideas what is the debt contract look like in Australia. Okay, so you can read this yourself. Okay, so last bit, let's talk about the role of external auditors. Okay, so why do we need to have external auditors for those at least listed companies? Because accounting information is so important. It's very important. It's everywhere, right? So we talk about contract. We talk about these